Welcome everyone. This is a SPSSI webinar organized by the Graduate Student Committee of SPSSI. For those of you who don't know, SPSSI is the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues. My name is Chom, a doctoral student in counseling and clinical psychology at UC Santa Barbara. I'm also the applied and policy work person at the Graduate Student Committee at SPSSI. I think although this is organized for graduate students, I think it can be very helpful for people in various stages of their career if they are interested in pursuing policy-related career. And a few logistics before we start. So the format for this presentation, we want to be as interactive as possible. So you are very welcome to ask questions and post questions in the chat section whenever you want throughout the section, throughout the webinar. The two panelists will present for 45 minutes for more information-heavy things. And the slides will be shared at the end of the webinar. So don't worry about taking notes, you will be able to get the slides at the end. And after panelists share, we will have Q&A sections at the end for about half an hour, 30 to 40 minutes. Okay, so that's the format. And now I'm going to introduce our two panelists. We are very honored to have two great panelists joining us. First panelist is Dr. Aarti Iyer. She worked as an academic for 17 years, most recently as a professor of social psychology at the University of Sheffield in the UK. Her research investigated the causes and consequences of challenges to social inequality by individuals and organizations. Aarti also applied theory and research to inform university policy, serving as the director for DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion in the psychology department, and the race equity lead in the Faculty of Science. During the 2021 to 2022 academic year, Aarti took a leave of absence to work as a congressional fellow in the Office of U.S. Senator Sherrod Brown from Ohio, where she was part of the health policy team. This experience convinced her to change careers, and she now works as a social scientist at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Aarti is part of a team that coordinates evaluation and evidence-building work across EPA programs funded by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. So welcome, Aarti. And our second panelist, Dr. Erica Felix, is a professor of clinical psychology at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and a licensed psychologist. She served as an American Psychological Association Congressional Fellow working on disability policy across the lifespan in Senator Casey's office in the U.S. Senator on the Special Committee on Aging. Dr. Felix's research has focused on the risk and protective factors affecting children's long-term mental health following natural disasters, mass shootings, and terrorism, and has been funded by the National Institutes of Health, National Institute of Justice, and the National Science Foundation. Her research has been published in peer-reviewed academic journals and covered by various news outlets. Dr. Felix trains counseling, clinical, and school psychologists on preventative interventions and trauma treatment for children, and has developed a disaster mental health class for undergraduates at UCSB. Yes, so we are very honored to have these two great panelists joining us. For those of you who are attending, please, if you can mute your microphone, and this seminar is recorded. So without further ado, I'm going to share slides for, I'm going to turn the floor to our two amazing panelists, and I will try to share my screen for the slides.
All right, so welcome everyone. Aarti and I serve together as congressional fellows in the legislative branch of the U.S. Senate, and we are glad to be reunited doing this work today. So I was the American Psychological Association Fellow, and she was your own SPSSI Fellow. So lots of opportunities. We're glad to be here. Our experiences were obviously in the legislative branch, but there are fellowships and policy related stuff in the executive branch, and there even was a judicial branch fellow our year. So just know, like, you're getting two people with kind of two different experiences on the Senate, but you can be on the House of Representatives side or the Senate on committees. You can be in different executive branch offices. We know a bit about the executive branch, and certainly Aarti does now, being on the EPA. So we'll try to fill in what we can, but we just wanted to let you know the limits of where our experience is. So next slide. Can you move to the next slide? There. Okay, good. I didn't know if it was frozen on my end or not. Okay, so we're going to talk briefly about our policy experiences to give you an idea of what if you chose to do a fellowship like this, what your day-to-day would be like. Then we wanted to talk about what opportunities are out there for you. And so we'll talk about the different kinds of fellowships that we know of. And it's beyond just psychology. So as you know and interact with graduate students from a variety of disciplines, there are people from every discipline out there doing these fellowships. People ask us, what skills and experiences do you need to even get these fellowships and to be successful on them? They are competitive. And we'll talk about that. And then how do you plan your career? All the opportunities we can think of, and then hopefully plenty of time for questions and answers. Next slide, please. All right, so you could see our class of fellows. So these were all the legislative branch fellows on the right. So you see us standing in front of the Capitol Hill. That's on our last week of fellowship. And so people came, there was quite a few psychologists there from a variety of organizations like the Society for Research on Child Development, obviously SPSSI, APA, but there was people from stats, from engineering, a variety of stuff. We got a picture of Aarti doing some of her work. Oh my gosh, like meeting a Supreme Court justice, is that? I did not even know you got that. Okay. All right, now I'm a little jealous. Okay, so awesome. It was a great year to be in Capitol Hill. Like, we were still affected by the pandemic, but things had opened up and there was a lot of amazing things happening. So as I already mentioned, we are going to be focusing on the Senate and the legislative branch because that's our experience, but feel free to ask other questions. Next slide. So, first, I want to kind of say that these fellowships are competitive and it's okay to try more than once. Like, I applied more than once. I didn't get it when I was a postdoc. I thought about just changing my career back then. I got to be a finalist, but I didn't get it. And then I just had to wait for a while, and this seemed to be the right year to do it. So my philosophy is that everything I've ever gotten, I've been rejected for at least once. So please, if this is what you want to do and you feel called to that, have a thick skin, keep trying again. So one of the things, so I've made a list here just to kind of talk through what I did on my policy fellowship. I ended up deciding to be on a committee, and a committee is a little different than being on for somebody's personal office. So Aarti can speak a little more about the personal office. With a committee, we organized a lot of hearings and did some stuff. In a personal office, you will have prep like your elected official for hearings, so you still have involvement. It's just not organizing and designing them from the ground up. The committee chairs and do that. One of the things I loved the most about this fellowship was meeting with stakeholder groups. I have never in my life met with more organizations, agencies, people like we're talking to my senators from Pennsylvania. I was talking to Pennsylvanians on the ground. We were going in state to meet with different organizations. And as psychologists, like I think that's what feels comfortable to us. And I enjoyed that the most, is just meeting with people, hearing what issue they were concerned about that was impacting their life, and and knowing what the senator may have already done on that in terms of policy and be able to speak to that, or let them know that I'm sharing it with them and that we're going to try to work on that with them. And so you get to hear so many different perspectives. I have a slide on it later, but just from all the range of views. And I think that really changes how you think about things, because I think a lot of us can end up in our bubbles. We all do, we're humans, but this kind of job, you hear from every angle. And so I appreciated that. The work you do to build positive relationships with people and make people feel comfortable is critical, and maintaining relationships with a variety of different professional association organizations. So people met with the APA, they met with the National Association of School Psychologists. I got to all that stuff to build good working relationships outside of the Senate and then within offices to get things done. So you were really trying to build, I'm like, you can't tell who likes you or doesn't like you in DC, because everybody's going to be nice to you because everybody's building good relationships. And Aarti, jump in whenever you want about any of this stuff. One of the things they first started, they kind of scaffold you to learn the role of a legislative assistant. And so you're being trained for that particular role in a Senate office. There's a lot of different roles in a Senate office. And so I know in my office, they first had me learn the steps to revise and submit previously introduced legislation, because obviously Congress changes every 2 years. And so anything that did not pass in the 117th has to be reintroduced in the 118th. And so we would work on that, make any improvements. We'd meet with community stakeholders, other people potentially affected by the legislation, try to improve it. You would reach out to other offices to get their support, sponsoring legislation. That means that they will vote for it if it ever comes up for a vote. So you do a lot of that. Then I got the opportunity to draft new legislation. You can see me holding on the way to the clerk's office, the 2 new pieces of legislation that I helped draft while I was there and that I got to build from the ground up, which was not anything I was ever trained in before. And it was a very different experience and I enjoyed it. I have done a lot of program evaluation work. So I actually really love doing a lot of oversight stuff. And we did that because I was placed in a committee office. Oversight is trying to make sure that the executive branch is accountable for the money that Congress is spending to enact different pieces of legislation. And so we would be monitoring to make sure that we were looking at disability issues and aging issues. And given that I've studied disasters, I was able to help work on this nursing home report to make sure that there's better oversight of how we evacuate and support elderly and people with disabilities in disaster. So that was good. Planned hearings. When Congress is out of session, it's not like things stop working. I know people are like, oh, Congress is only in session so many days a year. Oh, they're working all the time. That's just when we're voting. So there's lots of in-state community engagement. You go travel in-state, meet with people, and then you attend briefings where people come to we had one from APA on school violence, other different things. We've had a variety of briefings depending on your topic area. So I just went through everything there. Aarti, anything you want to add here? Because I know you did similar, but is there anything different?
So I worked in a personal office and I was on the health policy team. And while the sort of issues that we worked on were a bit different than what you focused on, Erica, I do think you've nicely summarized the kinds of activities that I went through. So I don't really have anything to add here. No, you did a great job of covering it all.
Okay, sounds good. I particularly liked my committee because it was kind of like the way they structured it, partly being in a personal office, part committee. stuff. And so I enjoyed it. And I honestly, when you go do this here, I'm going to backtrack a little bit. When you first get these fellowships, we get like 2 or 3 weeks training by the American Academy for the Advancement of Sciences on how government works. That in and of itself is like, takes your knowledge to the next level. Like people want to pay for that training, but it's only open to fellows. But then we go out and we interview with a bunch of different sites. And I didn't know I would end up, I'm a child psychologist. I didn't know I'd be on the Senate Special Committee on Aging. I'm working on older adult issues and people with disabilities, but it fit. And so you want to keep an open mind when you're interviewing, because at least with the other APA fellows as well, at least our year, where we ended up was not where we thought based on what we were imagining the summer before we started fellowship. And I see Aarti nodding as well. So I decided I had some experience with disability as a psychologist and a family member of a person with a disability, but the amount of new knowledge I gained, I really appreciate. Oh, and okay, I see, I keep thinking of things. What I also appreciate is the amount of breadth of stuff you have to learn about in the Senate, because you don't, in grad school, you hyper specialize, but they required us, even if our area was just like Aarti was saying, health policy, or mine was like, I was learning about residential care, even though, I knew some about it, but I was learning about Social Security law, like it was any issue. Like they gave me a lot of emergency management, mental health kind of stuff, but I got to learn about so many other issues I would not have spent time on. And that I think is great as well. Next slide, please. All right,
Okay.
Aarti's turn.
This is me, yes. So as I mentioned, because Erica's description of her policy experiences kind of covered what I did as well, I thought it might be useful to focus on what I do in my social scientist job, because that's sort of a unique perspective. But before I get into that, I have to do a standard disclaimer. So if you just bear with me for a second while I pull it up and read it out loud to you. So the views and opinions I express during this presentation are my own, not necessarily those of the United States government or the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. The views and opinions I express in this presentation should not be attributed to the U.S. EPA, nor should any official policy statement or position be inferred. Okay, doing this in my personal capacity. Okay, so yes, I thought it'd be useful to talk to you guys about what I do in my social scientist job, because many people are surprised to hear that a social scientist works at the Environmental Protection Agency. So I work as a program evaluator. And so basically that's kind of focusing on collecting evidence to answer questions about the effectiveness, the efficiency, or the equity of the various programs that EPA runs. And these questions can focus on sort of the implementation of the program or on its outcomes and impact. Okay, so EPA has hundreds of programs and focusing on things like cleaning up water, cleaning air, getting rid of lead pipes, cleaning up coastlines, cleaning up industrial sites, right? Promoting recycling behavior, et cetera, et cetera. So what I do is I work with the staff of these different programs to design, plan, and conduct evaluations of the work that they're doing. And these staff include, environmental scientists, biologists, chemists, economists, and people who focus on environmental justice issues, right? Because that's a growing central priority of what the agency does. And so I very much work on interdisciplinary teams when I'm planning and designing and conducting these studies. I also collaborate in writing up reports of this evaluation and evidence building work. I do a fair bit of training and sort of developing resources to promote a culture of evaluation across the agency, because not everyone knows about social science methods. And so kind of getting people to think about evaluations and evidence building in a rigorous way, but also giving them tips on best practices that they can employ when they're doing this work. I also work with the rest of the evidence and evaluation team to help develop strategies to promote the use of evidence to inform decision-making across the agency. So not just sort of evaluating what programs do, but also thinking, okay, how can we use that evidence to better do what the agency is supposed to be doing, whether it's policy development or budget formulation or strategic plan development and things like that. And then outside of sort of my immediate job, I also participate in networks and communities of practice that focused on program evaluation, data and measurement, and equity. So both within the agency here at EPA, but also across the federal government. There's a lot of these networks of people doing similar types of works in different agencies and governments. And we all kind of get together at least monthly to talk about our experiences and share best practices and tips and things like that. I think that's it. Yeah, next slide, please. Erica, it's back to you. You're muted, Erica.
Oh yeah, I was saying brilliant things while muted, but now, now I'll just start over and be mediocre. Okay, so now we're going to transition to what opportunities are out there for you. So next slide, this is just a transition. Say you want to do this. Okay, here is a list, at least of every policy that fellowship that I could find and their due dates. So just Google these and keep them on your radar. So I did the American Psychological Association one. We tend to have 2 legislative branch fellows, sometimes more, but they've started developing a lot more executive branch fellowships. So there's specifically some funded by the Substance Abuse Mental Health Service Agency now. And then the other APA fellow who was in the executive branch, she actually worked at the Institute for Education Sciences on social emotional learning stuff for children. So school psychologists out there know that that exists. So that's a great one. There's all of these fellowships, so a lot of different professional societies. There's Teach for America. There's so many things. They're all kind of, at least ours are coordinated through the American Academy for the Advancement of Sciences. They also offer their own fellowships. The stipend's actually a little bit higher than for APA or SPSSI, just to let you know. But all the associations are within like a certain range, I would say. And they also, some people, like the other woman that was an APA fellow with me my year, she has transitioned to an executive branch fellowship in the State Department. She is a clinician and had years of supervising grad students do their practica before coming to fellowship. So all the different career options, you become a fellow. So she has transitioned to doing one in the executive branch, working on refugee and migration issues. The American Educational Research Association, SPSSI, obviously, Society for Research on Child Development. They have both federal and state policy fellowship programs, so you don't have to just leave and go to DC, although it's a great place. And then Robert Wood Johnson Health Policy Programs. We had a lot of those in my particular office because they have some specific ones on aging. And that's a little more mid-career as well, because you have years of experience. We've had medical doctors. One of the fellows that, well, she wasn't a fellow, but she got hired as a staff on our committee. She is a former fellow who is nursing, like PhD in nursing, and switched to this and was part of the Robert Wood Johnson Health Policy Fellowship Program. And so, know that those exist. They vary on their length of time. Google them if you're interested. Next slide.
So this is me.
Jobs, that's you, right?
Yes.
Go for it.
Right. So on this slide, I want to talk to you guys about policy jobs in government, which tend to be restricted to, well, in the American government, which tend to be restricted to American citizens. On the next slide, I'm going to talk to you about policy jobs outside of government, which may be more open to folks who are not citizens of the U.S. And there may be more kind of parallels too in terms of those types of organizations in other countries as well. So on the previous slide, Erica went through like a really great list of policy fellowships, and that's definitely a good way to transition into this kind of work. But I think we all know there's a limited number of fellowships, and so don't feel like that has to be your only entree into doing policy work. It is possible to get a job in government or outside of government straight after finishing your master's or straight after finishing your PhD or after doing a few other things like I did for a long time, right? So yeah, these are other alternatives you can consider. And so I want to start by talking about policy jobs in government. And there's 3 different kind of categories of jobs that I want to cover. So the first one is focused on kind of program evaluation, data science, program analyst positions. And these are very frequently advertised in pretty much every department and agency across the executive branch of the U.S. government. So like the Environmental Protection Agency, Health and Human Services, Education, Defense, the State Department, Homeland Security, pretty much everyone has these positions because everyone cares about data and evaluating their programs and making sure they have evidence to back up the work that they're doing. And so you can really pick your favorite based on your areas of expertise and your areas of interest. I will say for these types of positions, evaluation, data science, program analysts, the emphasis is more on kind of your research methods, experience, and expertise rather than your subject matter knowledge, right? So when I got hired at EPA, I knew nothing about environmental policy. That didn't matter because that wasn't my job, right? Or that isn't my job. I'm learning about the policy as I'm learning about the programs to do the evaluations of them. And so this first bucket of programs is really meant, or this first bucket of jobs is really meant for folks who don't necessarily want to kind of continue to focus on their areas of like theory and sort of research expertise, but more want jobs that focus on methods and data science or measurement kind of more broadly, okay? Then the second category of jobs I've got on here is a policy specialist in Congress or the executive branch departments. So this is where you will need policy specific knowledge in a subject area, whether that's education or early childhood development or health, things like that, right? So broadly speaking, in Congress, you'll be parts of teams that kind of develop the policy, right? And in the executive branch departments, broadly speaking, you're focused on like implementing the programs that are funded by Congress, right? And so after I did my policy fellowship, I realized I was more interested in the implementation side and evaluating that than focusing on the actual development of policy, which is why I made that transition from the Hill over to the executive branch side of the government. And then last, we've got the subject matter expert at the Congressional Research Service. So this is the specific service within Congress. So they basically provide services to the House of Representatives and Senate offices. And the idea here is that they summarize information for Senate and House staffers based on requests for information. So it could be about, the history of a particular policy or theory and research around a thorny social issue. So CRS has a range of different experts there covering different disciplines and different topics and subject areas. And so when you get a request in your area, then you're called upon to write up a summary of the existing literature for them, for example, right? So that's a little bit different than the work done in the executive branch or in Congress itself, where you're focused more on developing policy or evaluating policy. Okay, so I wanted to give you guys some concrete information about where you find these jobs because I did not know this before I started. And so in that pink box at the bottom is the set of resources I found helpful. So any job in the executive branch, you go to usajobs.gov, you set up an account, and all of the executive branch jobs will be listed there, whether it's a policy specialist job or program evaluation or anything in that part of the government, right? If you want a job in the congressional branch, I recommend you look for the employment bulletin on the official House and Senate website. So if you go to house.gov or senate.gov and search for employment bulletin, you can sign up for an account and get the job vacancies emailed to you. And that way you can keep track of what's going on. If you want to work for the Congressional Research Service, you need to go to their specific website. So they're part of the Library of Congress. And so that website is there. Two other things to note about working policy jobs in the government. First of all, not all of them are based in DC. So many government departments and agencies have regional offices around the country. EPA is no exception. So I work with people in different offices like all around the US all the time. So don't feel like you have to move to DC to work for the federal government, at least on the executive branch side, right? But even in terms of the legislative branch, you might work in a state office of a congressman or a senator rather than having to come to DC and work in their DC office. There might be some flexibility there. I know a lot of people think about working a job fully remotely where you apply for a job in DC, but you stay where you are. That might be an option. You really have to look at the specific job advertisement to see what flexibilities there are around remote working. I will say, I think less than 30% of the jobs advertised across the executive branch departments are fully remote. So just something to keep in mind. There's not that many of those positions out there. Yeah, I'm not sure if that's going to change or not. Depends on how these broader conversations go, but that's, yeah, something to keep in mind. You're more likely to get an in-person job at a regional office rather than a fully remote job in the DC office, I would think. Yeah. And then the last point I want to make about these government jobs is that some of the government departments and agencies offer internships over the summer for grad students, right? So whether you've just finished your master's or you're kind of in between your master's and your PhD, this might be a nice way to kind of get your foot in the door and kind of learn more about what happens in these departments. And so, and each of them kind of run their internship programs separately. So what you need to do is identify the department or agency you're interested in working in, go on their website and sign up for information and alerts about their internship program. And then you'll find out more about how to apply and things like that. Yeah, next slide, please. Right. And I want to talk to you guys about policy jobs outside of the government, because I realize not everyone may be willing or able to kind of work with the American federal government specifically. Oh, I'm sorry. Could you go back one slide, please? Erica, you were going to talk about opportunities at the state level of government, because I only focus on the federal level.
Yeah, I just, from my experience and contacting like different people in the Pennsylvania state government, it just made me more aware of just opportunities at the state level. So you can think of state and even your county or municipality level, that there's a legislative and exec branch, all of that stuff. And so the state exec branch, like the California State EPA, all of that stuff, you can do similar stuff in your state. And in some degree, like you can have more influence because it's states like federalism. I don't want to get into all that, but like the federal government only has so much leeway to make change. Like states have a lot of authority and power. And so working at your state or local level, you could actually have quite a bit of impact in a way that you can't in the federal government. There's also obviously our state senators, our state assembly members, their budgets are not as big as for the federal government, so the pay might be different. But if you're looking at like summer internships or other things like that, I just don't want you to discount state or local opportunities because of like family obligations or life obligations that keep you in an area. You can even just look at your county and see what kind of things are in their Office of Emergency Management or their Department of Behavioral Health and stuff like that, and run programs. So that's all I was going to say there.
Yes, thank you. That's really helpful. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Now next slide, please. Okay. So policy jobs outside of the government. So you'll see sort of similar types of jobs here as I showed you on the previous slide, but now obviously focus on organizations outside of government. So there are a number of nonprofit organizations and foundations that are looking for program evaluators, data scientists, program analysts, because they want evidence to figure out sort of whether their programs are working well and how to improve them, right? So I've just thrown up some examples here, like the World Bank, Sierra Club, Gates Foundation, Save the Children. There's a whole bunch of them, right? So again, you can kind of pick the organization that focuses on issues that you're interested in, and then look to see what kinds of job opportunities they have. There are also think tanks and policy centers that do policy research, and so they hire social scientists to help out with that. So for example, the Bipartisan Policy Center, the Kaiser Family Foundation, which focuses on health policy, RAND, which has sort of divisions that cover the whole range of sort of academic expertise, and Brookings, which tends to focus more on economic and social issues like housing and stuff, but they do cover a broad range of issues. And then lastly, you've got policy specialists who have subject matter expertise who work in advocacy groups, formerly, I guess, known as lobbyists. And so the idea here is really to help the group kind of collate theory and research on a particular topic to help make the case to government that a particular policy is needed or a particular program is needed, right? So the APA has quite a large sort of lobbyist or advocacy group arm where they focus on communicating the latest theory and research to the government to help them make informed decisions about different policies and programs. There are also advocacy groups that focus on more sort of narrow topics like the Eating Disorders Coalition, or who focus on social justice issues like the NAACP or the ACLU and et cetera, right? So again, if you want to work on a particular sort of issue area or topic, you can identify organizations, whether it's a foundation or a nonprofit or a think tank, a policy center, or advocacy group that's working on that, and then see what kinds of jobs they have on offer. And again, I want you guys to have some information about where you find these jobs, because I did not know this. So you can go on particular organizations' websites and see kind of what jobs they have listed. But obviously, there's also more general employment sites, which kind of bring together all of the listings across a whole bunch of organizations and a whole bunch of occupational sectors. And so the general employment sites that have been recommended to me, I've listed on the screen. So Glassdoor, Indeed, ZipRecruiter, and LinkedIn Jobs, right? I'm sure there's others, but these are the 4 that I kind of focused on when I was thinking about what kinds of jobs I wanted to do. And again, want to remind you guys that not all these jobs are based in DC. You might find some of these organizations that have offices around the country, and some of them do offer internships. I know that RAND, for example, offers like summer research internships for grad students specifically, and they've got offices, I think, in Boston, in California, I think in Chicago as well. And so you don't have to come like all the way to DC, and Pittsburgh. Thank you. Yes, but Pennsylvania connection there. So you don't have to come all the way to DC to do these things. Yeah. Okay, next slide, please. Right, Erica, over to you.
Okay, I actually wanted to add something to our policy jobs list that I got intrigued by that we just didn't put on the slide. So if you're interested in research and program evaluation and accountability, there's the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, which Congress uses to do oversight on how executive branch is administering programs. So for example, looking at FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Association, and if they're equitably providing resources to people across like age, disability, race, ethnicity in following emergencies. Like there are a lot of Government Accountability Office reports. It has one of the highest job satisfaction ratings in the government. And you really use your social science research. They'll go interview people, do things, and they'll make like research studies to try to answer if the government is following through on what they're supposed to in implementing these programs. And then it's made publicly available, and you can check on whether if their recommendations are being followed through. So it's a whole accountability stuff. So if you get excited about accountability, know that exists. And probably at all the state levels too for state government. And then within that's run by Congress, or that they report to Congress, but within each agency, there's an Office of Inspector General, and they are doing the similar job within like the EPA or SAMHSA to look at if there's any waste of money, if we're not being efficient, stuff like that. So just know, Aarti, any other thoughts on that one?
So yes. So both of those types of jobs in those agencies and departments can be found on usajobs.gov. And I'm not sure about the IG offices, but definitely the GAO also has offices around the country, so you don't have to come to DC to work for them.
And I think that's a great way to use research skills. So go for it. All right, now let's go on to where we're going to the next slide. So next slide, All right, what skills and experiences do I need to develop? You want to know how to get these. We're going to give you our 2 perspectives. I'm sure there's others. And if you're interested in these kinds of things, reach out to former fellows well in advance of when you're applying, and just talk about the experience and get that. And then once you get these, you can reach out again and talk about strategies for like how to find your right placement and fit and all of that stuff. So there's a whole network. So next slide, please. All right, so you should have some policy interest, and we should be able to see that in your application materials. And so what I had done is I had been doing local grassroots advocacy related to human trafficking for about a decade, and doing like grassroots advocacy, meeting with our state and federal elected officials regularly about different legislation, about fully funding like the Office of Monitoring and Combating Trafficking in Persons, things like that. So I was able to have like a decade of that experience. Other fellows also had similar things, like maybe in grad school, they organized advocacy stuff, policy issues, things like that. And so knowing that and showing it, no matter what your discipline, having some way to show your policy interest, that you've had it for a while and that this seems to be the next right step. Aarti, do you have something you want to add for that?
If I can just add, so when I applied for the SPSSI Marshall Fellowship, I did not really have any sort of external policy experience the way that Erica's talking about. What I had was sort of university level policy experience, right? So because I was involved in developing policy around diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, like I felt like I could take those experiences and talk about them in a way that paralleled the kinds of policy experience that other folks had outside of the organization. So if you're the grad student representative on any of these types of committees, like that's policy experience. You can talk about that and say that now that you've done it kind of at the university level or at this very sort of local organizational level, you want to understand how to do it and on a broader scale. I think that's a perfectly valid way to kind of make that link from what you're doing now to where you want to go in terms of broader policy experience and involvement. Yeah.
Yeah. And then also they're really looking for, I mean, there's a lot of great scientists out there, but you need to be able to explain research methods, research findings, communicate science in a plain language way without a lot of variable jargon. And so my years of working with the community really helped that, because I was used to being able to translate ideas about methods, about why fidelity is important or things like that, or dosage in a way that people understood, and that had trained me for that. So how would you explain your dissertation to your grandmother? And if she starts glossing over her eyes, your grandma's a smart woman. Everybody in DC is very smart. It's just that they have to digest a lot of information and they don't have time to get hung up on acronyms, jargon. You have 5 minutes, you got to explain the main points well. So that I think is just critical. Like, Aarti, do you have anything you'd want to add right there? Okay. Ability to build and maintain positive relationships. Everything is run on relationships. So in your interviews and other stuff, they are going to be seeing how you relate to them. If you seem to need a lot of status, like it was good when I had said right away, like, oh no, don't call me doctor, it's just Erica. Like, because people will give you that deference because they don't know, but like, it's just good to be humble, know that you're learning a lot, that DC is run by lots of people in their 20s. I'm in my 40s. But so there's that deference, but like you want to be able to make relationships across age ranges, across like so many different things, and be able to just communicate and be well with everyone. I don't know, Aarti, anything you want to add? Okay. Flexibility, like your day has to be able to pivot. You have to be able to put like if somebody needs something in a certain amount of time, it literally has to get done then. Like so you have to organize your time well, you have to be flexible, you need to be able to pivot. So if you struggle with that, like maybe at least the Hill type stuff might not be, versus the executive branch might not be that. In terms of open-mindedness, like I think we all try to cultivate that, but you are meeting with people with so many different views and different angles. And even when people supposedly agree or are saying, yes, we endorse this legislation, the different advocacy groups can come at it from very different reasons of why they're saying yes. And so I have never heard more differences of opinion handled well in my life. So just be prepared that you'll come in open-minded, you'll become more open-minded about why somebody might be voting yes or no. And even if you're like, I wish they were voting yes, you kind of understand why they're voting no. And you're meeting with constituents, like all of our states are purple. Like I know when you watch the maps on CNN or whatever, it looks like red and blue, like everybody's family's purple. Like you have to be able to communicate things that cut across political divides. And make everybody feel like your job is to make sure that everybody who you have contact with feels respected by your office, regardless of whether you agree or disagree with what their stance on something is personally. So I think that kind of covered both of the last two. Is there anything you want to add, Aarti? No? Okay. Next slide. All right, this is you, right, Aarti?
Yes, this is me. So I think without really intending to, I think Erica covered kind of a lot of the sort of skills and experiences you need for work on the Hill and sort of the policy fellowship. And I ended up thinking more about skills and experiences needed to get a policy job, right? So particularly in the executive branch or in like a policy organization. And so not all of these are that's listed on the slide are going to be applicable to every single job. So you kind of have to take it with a grain of salt. But if you're interested in particular types of jobs, you might want to take a look at what's on here and kind of see what corresponds to that type of job so that you can focus on building those skills and experiences. But if you're interested in program evaluation, data science, measurement, program analysis, accountability research, like Erica was talking about, you absolutely need expertise in research. So that could be direct experience doing the work, but obviously you can't be an expert and have direct experience doing everything. So at the very least, you need to know that you're enough to be a critical reader and be able to communicate that expertise to other folks, right? So things like measurement, which is huge, right? How do we measure the things that we want to document, particularly in the messy real world of field research, right? Qualitative and quantitative methods, so not just focusing on one little niche expert technique, and knowing how to analyze data kind of across that qualitative and quantitative spectrum, because what I'm finding a lot is that outside of the academy, like there are not really any sort of pet peeves around like, this is my favorite method and this is what I'm always going to use. Like they take very seriously this idea that like the question directs the method, the type of data directs the analytic technique, right? And so you're going to need to know about a broad range of methods and analytic techniques in order to be able to do the different kinds of projects that will come across your desk. Even if you're not actually leading it, like you still need to know enough to be able to contribute as a team member. The second point is really, really important. This is not just a critical reader thing. You must have experience with practices in open science and quality assurance and quality control. I have been amazed at how rigorous and systematic this stuff is outside of academia. I did not really have a sense of it, but they take it really, really seriously. And so open science has been happening here in sort of the applied research world for much longer than it has been in social psychology anyway, in the academic world. And they have very rigorous systems and checks and methods set up for quality assurance and quality control to make sure that the data is collected in a rigorous and systematic way. So the more you have experience and practice doing that now, the better off you'll be when you're interviewing for one of these jobs, because you can say you've done it already. The good news is all of you are doing research in some way for your academic work. And so you have great opportunities to put this stuff into practice now. And hopefully it'll also improve the quality of the work you're currently doing for your academic work. If you're interested in doing research in one of these jobs, you really need to have engagement with applied research and or program evaluation. So not just kind of doing lab experiments, right? Because almost nobody does that here. And so I put in a couple of different ways you might develop that experience, particularly if your primary area of research doesn't involve applied work or program evaluation. So one thing you can do is learn as much as you can. So maybe your university's public policy school has a master's class on program evaluation that you can either audit or actually take to get that experience, right? You can also do a MOOC, so a massive open online course where these are sort of self-paced online modules, right, on a range of topics. And they're usually free, so you can get all that knowledge from really world-leading practitioners and instructors on your own. But if you want sort of a certificate or credit, you might have to pay a fee. I'm not sure. It depends on the specific university, and it may be that your academic institution has an agreement with a MOOC provider where you can get access to those courses and credit as part of your student kind of benefits, right? So I think you should ask about that. But if you're not able to do structured learning in terms of classes, you can pick up a textbook, you can watch webinars, you can try to immerse yourself in sort of that way of thinking and sort of what challenges are they talking about in terms of doing this work? What creative solutions do they come up with, so that you can sort of say that you've been exposed to that world, right? Like when you're applying for these jobs. If possible, it would also be great if you could look for opportunities to work on applied research or program evaluation. It doesn't have to be part of your formal academic work. So for example, if there is a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee, do they want help designing an evaluation to see, you know, like if they made some change to the way that they do hiring practices to try to make it more equitable? Did that result in an increase of applications from folks from underrepresented groups, right? So that kind of evaluation you can do to kind of dip your toe in the water and get some experience in doing, which will also help your organization, right? Your department or your faculty or your university. Project management is also another big thing. So it turns out, and I very naively did not know this, there's a whole social science of project management out there. And you can do degrees in project management. Most people don't do entire degrees in that. They take a class either through a MOOC or they do like a short-term certification course where they can say that they have a certificate in project management. And I will say, I feel like a lot of us intuitively are good project managers because we have to manage like the different aspects of our research projects and deal with different stakeholders like our many supervisors and sort of other folks and things like that. But project management gives you a system and a set of tools and resources to really work through all this stuff in a systematic way, which has really opened my eyes to how much more efficient we could be with all this kind of work. So do take a look at kind of what kind of certification you could get in that area. And then once you have that knowledge, you can actually practice that with your existing projects. And that way, you can say that you have some experience with it. If you're interested in doing program evaluation work, you're probably going to have to do some like outreach or engagement with the staff in your particular agency or department to kind of get them on board with the idea and also to socialize them in terms of the kinds of research you're doing. And so if you have any experience in teaching or mentoring or supervision, that's going to be really translatable to this kind of mentoring and teaching in this kind of policy organization. And then lastly, I found the 3 kind of categories of professional skills, which I'm finding most useful, are collaboration, being able to manage up. So managing your manager or supervisor, which I think we all have experience from our PhD academic advisors, right? So, and also figuring out how to navigate bureaucracy. So if you want an answer to a question and there's like a maze of different offices and people, like how do you get to where you need to go? And again, I think a lot of grad students have practiced with that, given that they have to navigate in institutions themselves, but it's just something to keep in mind, like that becomes especially valuable and translatable when you move into this kind of policy work. Yeah, next slide, please. Okay, this is you.
All right. So, so like Aarti, I have spent like 17 to who knows how many years doing research in academia and then coming to and thinking what I knew about research through that role and what I changed after being on Capitol Hill. And so in my role being trained as a legislative assistant, I wanted to just kind of tell you, because I know you are all a part of SPSSI because you want your research to have a social impact. And so this is the kind of research that I as a legislative aide in training or assistant in training was using. So descriptive statistics, like the government wants to know how many people are affected by a problem. And so all the prevalence, incidence rates of different things, like because they're tracking and they're allocating funding based on that, at least in the legislative role. And so it's simple, like that's your first quarter of stats in one of your grad programs. And so, yes, like we're taught a lot of fancier other things. You could use that in your different roles to account for error and do better things. But unless you can write it and explain it in a way that's easily digestible in 2 minutes, because that's what you've got, then I don't know, maybe you don't need to do the fanciest of stats. So I have been doing program evaluation. I was taught in my program as a community psychologist. And so I was constantly looking for different program evaluation outcomes data on programs. And I both found more data on certain areas than I thought and a lot less on others. And it made me rethink how maybe I'm touching on something I'll touch upon later, how important it is to get our program evaluation data disseminated beyond just the person who you're writing the report for. So for example, I was looking, in my disaster mental health experience, trying to write legislation to try to fund more programs that can help with emergency management for people with disabilities. And there was programs that I was talking to different states, many different states, and they kept pointing to one particular program. I go and look into it more deeply, and there actually was no evaluation data. I caught the developers on the phone, like people respond to you when you have a Senate email, and basically there was no data, but the exec branch needed to do something for people. They didn't have time for us to wait and make a program and to do it. And so we ended up deciding to wait and not try to create legislation that will provide more grant funding for that type of program, because we don't know if it would work. Like, the government wants to be, I know there's all the myths about it, but they want to be accountable for the dollars that they are spending. On the converse, like, I was also working on stuff on residential treatment for youth and foster care and other stuff. And we were like trying to do preventative stuff, like, so wraparound services. So I was like, okay, here's another idea. Like, let's try to fund more wraparound services. It's called different things in different states. And we found a fair amount of good evaluation data. And so we felt able to better advocate with the Health, Education, Labor, and Pension Committee to try to get more block grant funding for states to do this. I don't know that that happened, but I just want to say, like, if you're working on program evaluation, please try to get it out there on the internet somehow, because how I'm looking for data is by Googling and contacting congressional research services. We have access to ProQuest and everything else, but I look at trusted websites, various things, but try to get your data out there beyond just peer-reviewed academic journals. Those are important, but they are not I don't want them to be the end goal anymore for people. They're just a means to validate stuff. So do that. So we're busy. We're covering 1 million issues at a time. Our job is to read news headlines, world, national, state, every single day to keep abreast of the topics in our policy area. And so when research gets covered by the news, then we'd have weekend reads for the senator where I'd put different articles on disability related issues. And there was some on emergency management and a study about children being more exposed now to disasters than their grandparents' generation, like 6 times more. That research, which was published in an academic journal, but got news coverage, got in front of the senator. So if you take time and do press releases for some of your research that you think you want to get out there and try to work with media, that can help broaden the impact of your work. I mentioned GAO earlier. So I was constantly pulling up data from Government Accountability Office and Office of Inspector General reports. So incredibly valuable. And if you're really interested in a certain social issue, there's probably a lot of good data that's not in your peer-reviewed academic journal PsycInfo searches that you can find by looking at GAO office reports, so that you can get a scan of how different programs are being implemented across different states. Federal databases, there's so many good things by the CDC, the Department of Health and Human Services, Office of Aid, like all the exec branch. There's a lot of good data about how common things are, what are some specific factors that might contribute. So federal databases. I also looked on different national organizations like NASP or APA or other things for 1 to 2 page briefs on stuff. Like, they don't have time. They are so busy we don't have time to read your book chapter, unfortunately, even if we want to. So the organizations that had briefs that were easy to find on their website I just knew, and I, being a psychologist, I knew the organizations I trusted for good information on mental health. So I would just go straight to their website and see if I could find a policy brief on that or something that they had done. And then for those of you that love qualitative research, constituent experiences, critical. You need like the broader stat, but you need the personal story that can help move policy forward. So we were always collecting constituent stories, experiences. They know about the gaps in implementation better than the executive branch, the legislative branch, any branch. And so we constantly outreach and monitor that and keep track of that. So U.S. constituents, When you communicate with your office, they are keeping track of it. So you do have power today to influence things. So next slide. I've spoke about multiple perspectives already. So this is a hearing we got to organize, and I really found some policy gaps through talking with so many different people across state government, county government, parents of and grandparents of children with autism, people with different types of disabilities, and just finding like, it was just a wonderful experience to be able to learn from so many different perspectives, and it's actually guiding what I hope to do as research now that I am back in my faculty role. So just a great thing to do. I think I've talked about multiple perspectives on other slides too. So I'm just gonna flip past this in the interest of time. All right, Aarti.
Yeah.
How do I plan my career? I think you're up first, maybe?
Yes. Yeah, that's right. Yes. So this is the last section of our presentation. So we do want to focus on some tips for planning for your career. And so next slide, please. So I will start with the option of kind of moving outside of academia, and then Erica will talk about the options for staying in academia or in clinical services, depending on kind of where you're located. So this slide basically includes all of the kind of high level advice that I was given when I was sort of preparing to leave academia. And so a lot of it in the beginning is really about kind of learning more about what's available, right? So once you kind of work out, do you want to work in government? Which branch of government? Do you want to work outside of government? Or in my case, I didn't know. So I just kind of kept my options open. Sign up for job alerts on those relevant sites. So usajobs.gov, you can get a daily email with a summary of all the new advertisements with the keywords. So I just put in social scientist, which kind of covered program evaluation, data scientist, program analyst positions, right? But if you want a policy specific job that's kind of focused on a particular issue or subject matter, you can put in that as a keyword as well, right? But the important thing is to get those job alerts, and that way you can start to see what kinds of opportunities are available in the area that you're interested in. And then that takes us to the second point. Once you kind of identify the jobs, the kind of job you want, go in and get that position description, and that way you can figure out kind of what's the key set of sort of knowledge and skills and experiences that they require or that they consider to be kind of good qualifications for getting that job, right? Because then you have a sense of what you need to achieve or where you need to be in order to be competitive for that kind of job. And then the next thing I was told, I resisted this for a long time because I'm not a huge fan of self-promotion, but everyone said set up a LinkedIn profile and write it in a way that emphasizes the key knowledge, skills, and experiences that you want to showcase in order for you to get your desired job, right? So the LinkedIn profile, while it's sort of a way to kind of say, this is who I am, like it's really about self-promotion so that recruiters in particular can find you, all right? It doesn't matter how early or late you are in your career, recruiters use these LinkedIn profiles to kind of start to put together a list of possible candidates for different jobs. And so it's always useful to think about it in that way. I still don't use LinkedIn the way I should. There's a lot of resources out there that will help you figure out how to use LinkedIn for self-promotion, for networking and professional development. And there's a lot of free stuff out there in terms of blogs and videos. So do take some time to figure out kind of what you need to learn about how to use LinkedIn to make it work for you in this job search. The other thing that I was encouraged to do, which again, I resisted a little bit, was sort of building contacts in your desired occupation. So this could be through professional society. So if you want to do work in the government, kind of identifying folks within SPSSI who have experience doing that, whether it's former fellows or people who've left academia, alumni connections. So again, if you set up a good LinkedIn profile, LinkedIn will start to suggest connections for you based on the affiliations you put in. And then you should be able to kind of cross-reference the alumni connections with the occupational sector you want to end up in, and then identify people who are in those areas. And then also in your personal networks, right? So I have extended family members who will often contact me to say, hey, I'm interviewing for a job, but it turns out that the person who's one of the people on my panel went to the same place that you went to for your undergrad. Like, do you know this person? They seem to have graduated at the same time. Do you know this person? Like, is there anything you can tell me about them? Right. And so people are not shy about asking around like that. And no one seems to get offended when you ask those kinds of questions. So don't be shy about doing that yourself in terms of your personal networks and extended personal networks as well. And part of the reason for collecting all these contacts takes us to the next bullet point, which is it's a great opportunity to do brief informational interviews with these folks. And that way you can learn about what they do in their jobs and how they got there, and do they have any advice for you, right? So this is a 15-minute conversation or a 30-minute conversation. You're just asking them questions about themselves, so they don't have to do any prep. They don't have to read anything. They're just having a chat about their experiences and their trajectory to this point, right? I found that really helpful because it narrowed down sort of the options in terms of what I wanted to do once I learned more about what these jobs actually were from the people that I talked to. And then last but not least, it's useful to invest time and money on your resume and your cover letter to make sure you get that right. And so there's books out there on how to do the federal resume, which I found really helpful. So there's a chapter. So the book that I got has a chapter on how to move like from outside the federal government to inside the federal government, like how to fix your resume from that external set of requirements to the federal government set of requirements. And so, yeah, that gave me clear, concrete, sort of specific advice for what I needed to do and gave lots of examples throughout. So definitely worth picking up one of those books. Hopefully you can borrow it from the library. I had a friend of a friend who had bought one when she applied for a federal job, so I just borrowed it from her. But ask around. You should be able to get some stuff for free if you're not able to afford to get it yourself. I also got a career coach because I needed to figure out sort of how to compress 17 years of academic experience into a 2-page resume. And this career coach was super helpful. It was not cheap. It was about $200 an hour. And I think I spent 3 hours with him in total in terms of his prep time and the time that I met with him. And I totally understand that I was in a very privileged position to be able to do that, but there's got to be cheaper career coaches out there who can still give you a really valuable experience. Or maybe you can find a career coach in training who will give you a discounted rate as they're building up their experience, right? So yeah, I think talking to someone who has expertise in this area can really help you put together a stronger application. But even if you don't work with a career coach, when you have a draft resume, send it to everyone you know who works in or adjacent to your desired occupation and get feedback on it, because that's the best way to make sure that the hiring committee, which will literally take 2 minutes to look at your resume and often doesn't even look at your cover letter, it ensures that they will pull out the right pieces of information and see you as a good candidate for that job. Yeah. Right, so I think I'm done with that. Next slide, please. Right, so this is over to you, Erica, please.
Okay, and yes, the getting it down to 2 pages is critical because they won't spend time. And I actually didn't, I really appreciated that exercise. We had to do it just for our fellowship even before, and it sounds like Aarti, you had to do it again for this, but it was really good to figure out how to distill 20 years of academia into that and do the relevant skills. So it's just a good exercise. And if you get one of these fellowships, they give you some professional development funding. And so a lot of people use that funding for their career coaching. So you might think like, I'm right out of grad school, I don't have that. You will get paid for, like, you will have some money through that if you wanted to stay and do a career coach. Okay, so a lot of people try this and do this as a sabbatical, and some do it to pivot into a different kind of career, and some people return back to academia. So I returned back to academia. So, but I think that this was still such an incredibly valuable thing. So I want to talk about that. So next slide. Oh, and some people who were postdocs, they were like doing this and then they wanted to go back to academia as well. And so it just makes you a better academic, I swear, I promise. It's transformed, not completely. I was always a community engaged researcher, and I'm very privileged to be in a department that was incredibly community engaged. So one of the biggest complaints I heard from academics who were maybe fleeing their place was that they didn't feel like their science was having an impact. I do not feel like that at UCSB where we're at. And so that's part of the reason I probably chose to go back, because I like the influence I can have here. But it made me think about just new new ways to think about my research. Let me just try a different word. So one of it was just even as simple about sampling stuff. I know in academia, we're always like, okay, who's this going to generalize to? And the cream of the crop is a nationally representative sample. And that is very important for certain kinds of questions. But if you want to influence local or state policy, defining it by like Californians or just by your county offices would love to get that research and use that. And so, yes, it's harder to justify in academic journals. I've just had practice doing that on a revision letter where I'm like, no, my community needs assessment was not meant to generalize because it's for a community thing. The methods can generalize, but the results aren't supposed to. So you just rethink sampling issues and design issues from the beginning when you're thinking about if this is going to be used potentially by policymakers, because they want to know about constituents in their community, and that will do that. And you need mixed methods, like it's just critical. You do need the quantitative stuff to get like estimates of how many people are affected by this and of the risk and protective factors or things that contribute to a social issue, how many are experiencing what. But you need also the stories that can go pair with that broader stat to move policy forward or to move public opinion forward on something. We've talked a lot about program evaluation, and so keeping that up. If you don't have that in your program, do please try to take classes in that or do something or get involved with a professor that does. So critical. And making sure that, again, that stuff gets published or out there somewhere that's not just collecting dust on the people's office. Like, you did important work. Like, I was looking for so much stuff and I believe it's out there, but I couldn't find it. And so do that. I specifically want to go and work more with offices of emergency management at the county and state level. So that's why I specify emergency management in this one. I mentioned this a little earlier as well, but dissemination strategies. And to be honest, after being back in academia for almost an entire school year now, it's so hard to find the time to do this, but I am still committed. I'm going to do this. But when you have papers that you think might be useful for your policy, like maybe your congressional rep or your state or local assembly member, state senator, making one pagers, like literal one page, and starting with the main point, the results. We caveat a lot with the background, the methods, all that stuff. You need to justify it, but they want to see the main points early on. So you just write differently. And taking the time to have a dissemination strategy beyond the submission to the peer-reviewed journal. Still important. That's a measure of quality people are looking at, but taking time to have a press release or to work with your department's communications. And there's government affairs people at every university that would love to work with social and other scientists, all scientists, to communicate their research more broadly. And then just grant writing. I don't know. It changed how I review grants too. I'm much more like, I'm looking at like the purpose. A lot of people get in the most scientific-y part, but I'm like, okay, is this actually going to benefit people or change our practice on the ground? And if it's not doing that, I don't care if it's asking a new scientific question. Like, who is going to benefit from your research, practically speaking, and not in just these general vagues, like people should teach people coping skills. You're like, what kind, for what situation, when, and what's the gaps? Like, those are the questions you need to ask. So blah, blah, blah. Next slide. Okay. So my other APA fellow practitioner. So you don't have to be a research academic stuff. You could have been in practice. And I know as a licensed psychologist, there were so many gaps in policy I was experiencing. The receiving end when I was trying to get services for children that maybe needed more than my outpatient care, but didn't want to jump to a hospital. And so that was also one of the main drivers for me going and doing this fellowship. So even if you are looking to go into a practitioner career, you do need to stay abreast of policy. It is how you're funding for your agency, your program, your service. Whether you're in private practice or working for an agency, agencies are constantly writing grants and they're following what the state and federal government is putting in the pipeline because they know that's going to be the next thing funded. And so you do, and we're not teaching that. We're teaching how to be therapists and counseling, clinical and school psychology programs. I get it. but you have to pay attention to the administrative stuff, the grant writing stuff, and follow policy in your discipline. It also, like things like mental health parity, like we passed that a long time ago, but it's not being implemented the way it should. And so even as private clinicians and private practice and billing to insurance companies, parity issues come up. And so being involved with your like local psych association and all that, and being engaged in advocacy is critical. So policy stuff impacts your life no matter what. So, and if you are a practitioner and you've had those years of experience, people on Capitol Hill and the exec branch will welcome that in these fellowships. So just know, whatever the route, there's probably a spot because they're working with so many different people. All right, next slide. Questions, finally, here. We were so thorough, you probably have none, but just kidding. We are open for questions, and so you can put it in the chat or just raise your hand and unmute yourself, and we will look for that. And so I'm going to try to follow all the messages. If I missed stuff, maybe Chongzhen,
Yes, I'm here. Right. So feel free to post questions in the chat. We have one question already. We have a student clinician from a PsyD program who has a lot of experiences working with various communities and has a master's degree in international policy and development. They are seeking any career advice. Yeah, that's my understanding. They also have previous experience as okay, so actually I think they raised their hand. Nathaniel, yes, please go ahead.
Hi, first I want to say thank you for the work that you all have done. I mean, I stand on the shoulders of people like you. Yeah, I have a master's in international policy and development, specialized in human trafficking and migration. I remember back when I was talking to my professors about how I wanted to combine psychology and public policy and international relations. They kind of like were like, "How are you going to do that?" It's just so they're completely different fields. And I'm young, 29, and I'm getting into my third year, and I'm starting to see the field talk about policy more. And I'm just curious about how can I implement myself as someone who I speak Espanol. I was a former Peace Corps volunteer. I kind of tried to make sure I did the steps back when I didn't know I was going to be a doctoral student at the time to kind of get to how I can help with mental health and public policy and build a bridge. And so, yeah, I'm just curious of how I can fit into this world that y'all are talking about.
Yes. So I think, if look at these fellowships, there was like about 200 executive branch fellowships. There's only 20, some of us legislative. You might be more interested in exec, but there were people working with USAID, doing internal policy stuff, like our former
State Department.
State Department. There are so many, and including some surprising ones. It's not just always the big heavy hitters, the first names you think. And so you're just the wealth of experience you've said right there, that would be great, make you incredibly competitive for this. So I just say, go for it. Look at these fellowships, look for jobs. The fellowships are a nice way for you to check out an exec agency and them to check out you for a couple of years. And you can decide, do I really want to be in this environment or another one? It makes you look really good for all of the different advocacy or think tanks or NGOs that will be working in that area. And you'll develop so many connections. So I think you're doing the right thing. You have the right experience. Think of these fellowships or jobs. But if you're not sure which branch or other things, a fellowship is a great way to get started.
Thank you so much. A professor told me about y'all's webinar, and so I'm from Alabama, so I say y'all a lot, but I'm very academic, trust me. But I truly appreciate y'all.
We love y'all, and people in Capitol Hill will love that too. So
they do.
Yes. No,
yes.
They
not
do.
Always for the right reasons, but yes.
All right.
We have another question. What and who determines the specific work that you do, or the specific program to evaluate the policy to develop?
Okay, I can start with that one. So most of the federal agencies now have an evaluation officer for sort of the whole department or the whole agency. And that person works with the executive leadership of that agency or department to set out an evaluation strategy. But the idea is pretty much every program that's being funded by federal dollars should have an evaluation and should be doing evidence building work along the way so that we can keep an eye on things for accountability, but also for learning and improvement, right? And so really the evaluation team is kind of covering all the work that the agency or department is doing. And then we just figure out how to divide things up, right? So in my case, when I joined, there was a real need for someone to work with all of the programs at EPA that are funded by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And that covers, the Office of Water, the Office of Air and Radiation, the Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention, which is how I ended up working with 23 different programs that cover a whole range of different topic areas, right? And so yeah, it depends on the strategic plans that are set out by the sort of senior executive folks. And it also depends on your interests and sort of how much scope there is to have those conversations and to say, like, this is what I'm interested in. In my case, I knew very little about any EPA work. So I said, put me where I'm useful. As long as it's social science related, like I can figure it out. But I know other folks have come in and said, look, I have specific expertise and experience in environmental justice. And so they focus more on environmental justice projects in particular, right? So I think it really depends. Yeah.
And in legislative stuff, if you're looking at policy and that, your legislative director kind of looks at the priorities. You look at the senators or House of Reps priorities. And so you try to find somebody who's doing work in the area that you are most passionate about. So our other APA fellow, she was really passionate about maternal and child health issues and worked with Robin Kelly in Illinois on that, and just was a perfect fit for that office. So Samreen, if I said your name right, you have your hand up. Feel free to ask your question.
I do. Am I audible and visible to everyone?
You are.
Thank you so much. I just want to thank SPSSI, first of all, for organizing this. And I'm tuning in from India, actually, and it's 2 a.m. here. But I stayed up because why not? And I'm a huge fan of Dr. Aarti Iyer's work, and her 2020 paper actually got me into working on allyship and solidarity. And that's the work that I want to go into for my PhD as well, which I'm hoping to start in 2024. So I mostly work in minorities, experiences with collective action, and also climate action, collective efficacy in young adults. So I ideally want to combine these for my doctoral studies. And my question is that as a doctoral researcher, how can one ensure that their work has some sort of policy relevance? One would want to start networking with stakeholder organizations like a refugee council, etc., at the outset of the research, but how does one go about establishing such contact is my question. Thanks.
I mean, yeah, I think different professional associations filter down because there's tons of legislation introduced. And so some are signaling, some might actually move, some are whatever. So I think following your professional association and just looking at any volunteer opportunities. I had volunteered with a humanitarian organization for 10 years and learned policy advocacy, and I used them to filter out like what were the main human trafficking policy priorities that looked like would have bipartisan approval and we could advocate on. So I think all of those are critical ways. So just following like the different policy relevant stuff and gaining that. Then you could also like look and see if you know that there's a certain elected person that is kind of a champion for an issue that you care about. You can just look at the press releases on their Senate or House web pages and see what current things are happening in that area. I learned a lot about what policy was happening at the moment just by looking at the press release page on different elected officials' websites. And then I still look up stuff. You can look up congress.gov and look up legislation or type in keywords. Congress.gov, or which one is it? Yeah, congress.gov, right? I was just thinking my mind blanked for a second. So yeah, want to know like what it is, because yeah, we could say this has policy implications, but what I found going over there is that the people immersed in policy are like, yeah, we're already doing all that. We want scientists to tell us something new to do. And so us not knowing and following policy does impact what our science can do. You will write policy implications and practice implications in your academic articles differently after you have this policy experience. And so to the extent you have the time to start developing those skills now, you're just going to be a much more impactful academic or researcher, or however you decide to be a psychologist.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah, definitely.
Thank
So I
you.
agree with everything that Erica said. If I can just add, so you mentioned kind of working with community organizations or kind of connecting with sort of key stakeholders. I think that can be really, really important too. So even if you're not thinking about policy kind of at the sort of state or federal level, you could be thinking about sort of using evidence to inform the practice of organizations who are working in this space, right? So collaborating with them maybe to figure out kind of what questions do they want answers to, and can you guys work together to do some research? It may not be sort of a central part of your PhD sort of dissertation, but it might be incredibly useful to them and to you in terms of building these skills and the networks. And maybe they have like an advocacy arm where they can work with you to make this research known to the policymakers and sort of give it higher visibility that way. Yeah.
I see we are out of time. So hopefully we answered your questions. I'll hand it back to you.
Oh, thank you so much, both panelists, for your expertise and sharing so much information and helpful advice. I've learned a lot. I just want to acknowledge all the helpful information shared by Sarah in the chat, our policy director, SPC. Thank you so much. I don't know if you want to say something before we end.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, just happy to be here. I'm always happy to share info. SPSSI loves you. And yeah, please apply for our programs. Apply for all the programs. We all love each other. APA, SRCD, AAAS, we all talk to one another. We all work with one another. Every program is amazing. So apply for them all. They're all wonderful. Coming to Washington is wonderful. Apply for the state programs too. They're great. And I think not enough people know about them. State policy is awesome. And policy happens so much at the state level too. And yeah, just do policy everywhere all the time. And come to our conference and come to the grad student and policy pre-cons, and you will learn so much more too. So that's my 2 cents.
Okay, thank you so much, Sarah. Maybe I would just post one last final question for both panelists, or including Sarah. What would be one piece of advice you can give to graduate students before, like you wish you had known before you started doing policy work, as our ending?
I mean, just try for it. I guess I've said it all in that, like, there is a wealth of careers out there that you can't even imagine. So just put yourself out there, follow your passion, and you'll find a route.
Yeah. Yeah. So for me, I had never had a job outside of a university context until I did the policy fellowship. So, I mean, I worked at a YMCA as a camp counselor when I was in high school. But once I started college, every summer was spent on campus as a research assistant or working in the library or something. And then I went to sort of grad school, postdoc, academic positions, right? So I never even understood what it means to work in an office, right? And so I guess, and I think that lack of knowledge kind of kept my mind closed about other opportunities. And so I would say, keep an open mind, learn as much as you can, talk to people in different areas, make use of all the different resources that SPSSI has, because I think I didn't do that enough. And so I feel like I came to this realization late in my career, but it doesn't have to be this late at all. If you pay attention to the resources that are available and then take advantage of them.
And I think my one takeaway is the theme of our policy workshop this year, which is that there's no one way to do policy work. You can do policy work in academia. You can do policy work on the Hill. You can do policy work at a think tank. Don't feel limited by your setting or what issue you work on or what area of expertise or what degree you have. are a million and one ways to do policy work, and don't feel like it's defined for you. There are many ways, many paths to get there. And you can explore all of that through SPSSI and through all of the partner societies we work with.
Thank you so much, you all. The slides are shared in the chat. I just changed the settings, so now you should be able to access the link with the slides. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us and tuning in. And thank you again to our wonderful panelists. Okay, have a great weekend. If it doesn't work, we will send our slides to the people who registered. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks everyone for coming. Hope it was useful. Bye.